everybody. Welcome to the first in our 2018 New Mexico Main Street webinar series that we're kicking off today. We're excited you can join us. My name is Anna Bly, and I'm the Communications and Media Specialist here with Main Street. Just to let those who are joining us know, this is part of a concurrent series of lunchtime webinars that we'll be using to provide an overview of the Main Street 4-point approach, with each session being devoted to a specific point. And the series will culminate in how to achieve Main Street America Accreditation and information about becoming a certified director. Attendance is required for new executive directors, but of course we invite nonprofit leaders and board members and others to attend, and we will be recording this session. Today's session will be presented by Main Street Revitalization Specialist, Eduardo Martinez, and today's session will cover kind of a history of Main Street and introduction to the organization point. Thanks for leading the session today, and welcome, Eduardo.
Thanks, Anna. I appreciate it, and welcome everybody to the webinar. As Anna said, just a little bit of context up front. Those of you who were with us at the quarterly meeting in Portales last fall, we discussed how we were changing some of our trainings for new executive directors. And so the orientation, the webinar today is going to be a little bit of a longer session. We did the 4 points orientation usually in an on-site training here in Santa Fe over the years, and now we're moving this to segments via webinar. So this one is probably going to be a little bit longer. It is directed, the content mostly around for new executive directors and new board members. Those of you who have attended it before, our training before, good to see you back in the participation of this webinar. You'll probably see some information that you've seen before. So again, we've got about, this presentation probably gonna be about 40 minutes or so. I'll try and move quickly so that we can get to some questions before the end of the webinar, before the end of the period. So I'm going to move forward here. A little bit about the webinar presentation. You have a control panel on the side of your screen. If it's in the way of seeing the slides, you can just hit that little orange arrow at the top of that control panel, and it will close that. It will close that. If you need to get back in to ask questions, you can do that as well. We're running the presentation in audio only mode, and then when we get to the Q&A piece, we'll try and see if we can unmute some of you to present your questions as well. All right? You can use the call-in number. It's not the one you see on the screen here, but it should have been the one that came with your registration number. If you're having problems hearing us over the speakers on the phone, it's usually a bandwidth issue with the internet. So sometimes you might want to just go ahead and use the phone and dial into that number. Right? At the end of the session, we'll spend some time answering questions from the audience. There's two ways to do that. So there's one way is to hit the raise hand option, which is in the control panel. There's a raise hand option. You hit that button, and we'll see it on the screen that you're trying to ask a question. We'll unmute your audio. You can ask the question, everybody will hear it. The other option is to use the question box that's also in the control panel. You can type something in, and we will respond to the questions there as well. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. A little bit of background on the history of Main Street. So Main Street was started in the mid-1970s, really as a response to what was happening with our traditional commercial districts around the country. So historically, Main Street was the community's primary commercial hub before World War II. And after World War II, we started to see a big movement of the population out to the suburbs, right? And so the market tended to follow the client base, the customer base. And so you saw a lot of business moving out of Main Street in the traditional districts and moving into the suburbs areas as well, right? At the same time, we saw a lot of changes in federal policy that were affecting how historic buildings were managed and maintained. And Main Street started at the National Trust for Historic Preservation, first a historic preservation initiative, and then second, adding the economic development component. So Main Street's a movement to preserve the historic assets while rebuilding the vital economies in the historic downtown district of a community. So what is the Main Street program? We like to say it's really about real people doing real work to revitalize their economies and preserve the character of their downtown districts. More specifically, it's a strategy a proven strategy for revitalization. Again, early 1970s, when Main Street was started through the National Trust for Historic Preservation, using the 4 points approach. It's a network of linked communities. There are Main Street exists now in 42 states, almost 2,000 communities around the country, and we often see most of those communities getting together for the National Main Street Center Conference, the next one coming up in Kansas City in March. Third, Main Street is a national support program that leads the field, and in New Mexico, the National Main Street Center has authorized New Mexico Main Street Program as the coordinating body for New Mexico. But most importantly, and I'll clarify this a little bit here shortly, Main Street's an asset-based economic development approach to restoring your economies, right? And we want to explore that topic a little bit, because I think sometimes we get caught up in just sharing the jargon, and so we just want to distinguish the difference between what we call classic-based economic development, which is also, you'll also hear E-based economic development, from the asset-based. So E-based economic development is usually large-scale economic development projects. That's where your economic development leaders are usually working with site selectors to recruit companies from out of state or from other areas to move into your community. Heavy focus on manufacturing, construction, infrastructure, transportation. Call centers is a good example of an E-based economic development example as well. Usually the recruitment piece focuses on the export of goods. So you're creating something and exporting goods to another location. That's where the resources come in. Classic economic development, E-based, usually leverages public resources for infrastructure and incentives. So incentives such as in New Mexico, the LIDA fund, as well as the JTIP, Job Training Investment Incentive Program, to really recruit those types of businesses to a community. We look at asset-based development as a term that describes community economic development. So it's a focus on a bottom-up approach, as opposed to having economic development leaders and site selectors really do the recruitment at the top and bring in the community. Asset-based really focuses on what does the community want and or need in its district, in its downtown district, with respect to economic development. Heavy focus on your assets, your natural, environmental, your cultural, your social assets, and most importantly, your economic assets, and how you leverage those into economic growth and sustainability. Asset-based economic development builds on your local resources to strengthen the local and regional economies with a very strong engagement in the small business core of a community, retail, hospitality, and entrepreneurism. It does leverage local investments like local LIDA, and then some state funding for local infrastructure supports as well in the asset-based approach. I distinguish those because I want to just make sure that we put out, you really need both types of economic development in the state and in the community for a community to thrive economically, right? So they're both needed for a strong economy. The asset-based approaches are a lot more critical in communities where E-based economic development is not feasible, right? So we have a lot of rural communities that just do not have the resources or the assets needed to draw in a manufacturing plant or a call center, right? So this is where asset-based approaches are really much more critical. And then Main Street in New Mexico is really one of the primary examples of asset-based community economic development. There are some businesses that cross over into both. So brew pubs are a good example, and distilleries are a good example of an asset-based economic development entity in your district. But once they start manufacturing, bottling, or canning and selling that product externally, it really does become a crossover into sort of an E-based economy as well. Successful asset-based economic development requires strong leadership. It requires innovation. It requires collaboration in your district. You have to really look at asset-based approaches from an outside-the-box perspective. You're rethinking your traditional economic development paradigms. It does require funding like everything else, and importantly, it requires a lot of patience. So asset-based economic development, we always say one of the 8 guiding principles is incremental change, which means it takes time to see the change in a Main Street or an arts and cultural district around the economic development work that you're doing. Asset-based, again, the first word in asset-based is the asset piece, requires an asset mapping. Let's understand what our assets are in our community, and then mobilizing those assets is an action step that requires that organizing, the partnerships, the relationships, and that collaborative work. So what's it mean to be a Main Street community a designation? And I think this probably also applies to an arts and cultural district. First of all, it means that you've been officially designated by the state regional coordinating program. In that case, that would be New Mexico Main Street, that you're implementing the Main Street 4-point approach to advance your economic development goals, and that you are meeting or striving to meet the annual accreditation criteria. So that's at it in a snapshot. That's what it means to be a Main Street community. The map here shows all of the communities that New Mexico Main Street is engaging right now. There are 28 Main Street communities. There are a number of previous Frontier and community projects listed on here: Anton, Chico, Springer, Wagon Mountain. Those are Frontier community projects. And there are 8 arts and cultural districts in the map as well. So if you look at the map, 30 of the New Mexico's 33 counties, in the last couple of years, New Mexico Main Street has had either a Main Street program, arts and cultural district, or some other project there as well. Some of the benefits of the asset-based approach, first of all, as you really start to move your work forward, you create a healthier business climate for local businesses. You expand the customer base. You start to create that sense of a revitalized, a vibrant place for people to do their commerce and to live and work in as well. It deters leakage. One of the benefits is to try and keep the leakage, which is people buying their products in the neighboring community or maybe even online because they can't get those products in your community, right? So you're strengthening the business environment. Overall, for the community, the benefits are that you're revitalizing the bigger economy, a bigger zone of economic growth. You're strengthening your tax base by increasing the GRT, the gross receipts taxes. You're restoring your civic and your community spaces that people want to engage. You have access to resources and improve the quality of life. And all of those things lead to deterring people from moving away from your community into other communities where they might get the resources. The big benefit at the bottom is the technical assistance for being a Main Street program, technical assistance provided by the New Mexico Main Street program. A little bit about the impact. So this is the last 5 years of performance by way of net new businesses and building rehabilitations and investment. This data is actually collected by the Main Street directors, and hopefully our board leaders are reviewing those along the way when they get submitted to New Mexico Main Street. The numbers on the left side of the hash mark are basically all the communities, and then on the right side of the line we separated out Albuquerque, Las Cruces, Roswell, and Farmington, right? So this is all the rural communities that are of a smaller size, usually less than 25,000 people. So you'll see over the last 5 years, almost 700 net new businesses, more than 1,000 building rehabilitations, 158 million in new building construction, and this is just within the boundaries of a Main Street district. 93 million of private sector investment, 55 million of public sector investment. Those are usually public infrastructure projects like sidewalks and streetscapes. 2,600 new jobs, and that is a net number. And then more than almost 200,000 hours of volunteer time, and which amounts to about $3.5 million of leveraged resources just for projects within the Main Street districts around the state. Historically, Main Street, I mentioned earlier, focused on the 4 points approach. So I'll just start it over here on the top right side, what that was about. The idea behind Main Street is that you implement work in these 4 areas, and that was your key strategy to revitalizing your district, right? So the first one, design, enhancing the physical elements of the district and capitalizing on its assets. This includes urban planning work, public art, facade squads, historic preservation of buildings, placemaking. All of those types of projects fit in under the design component. Under promotions, at the lower right, the promotions positions the district as the center of the community and the hub of economic activity by creating a positive image that showcases your unique characteristics and assets of the district. Promotions includes events, fairs, festivals. It heavily focuses on branding and marketing. What is the message that you're trying to send? So when you think of downtown Roswell and what is the Roswell Main Street about, you'll hear a lot of people think the first thing they think of is the alien and the UFO museum, right? That's embedded in part of their promotion work as well. That's part of their brand and part of their image. The big, I think, front and center important one is the economic vitality work, and the organization design and promotions work should really support the economic vitality. What are you trying to accomplish economically in your community, right? So you're building economic opportunities and creating a supportive business environment for small business owners, entrepreneurs, innovators, and this also includes live work housing as well. And the final one at the top left is the organization piece, is making sure that all your resources, whether that's partners, that's funding, that's volunteers, all of those are mobilized to implement a community transformation vision, right? So the organization really ties in all the 4 points together. Organization design and promotion, the ultimate goal is to really have an economically vibrant downtown district. A couple of years ago, most of you have heard about the Main Street refresh, shifted the focus a little bit from just focused on 4 points to a much broader sense of what is your economic transformation strategy that you want to accomplish in the district, right? So we asked at National Main Street Center, came out of this refresh process, asking the state to implement this in all its Main Street communities. We have asked all of you at the local site to establish a couple of transformation strategies. We're looking at doing the same. We will probably, in New Mexico Main Street, probably implement a similar approach to the arts and cultural district as well. But your transformation strategies have to be rooted in a market understanding and a vision, and then lead to some outcomes as well. Now I'm going to explore this one a little bit more in depth later in the presentation. Before we get too far, I just want to mention a couple of the other programs that New Mexico Main Street has started. First of all, the arts and cultural districts focus on enhancing the creative or the cultural economy, and those of you who were at our quarterly meeting last week heard Jillian really clarify the difference between the arts and cultural economy and the creative economy. But the ACDs focused on positioning arts and culture at the center of the revitalization work in a district. Right? Frontier communities focus on community economic development projects and communities of less than 7,500. So this is a short-term project that gets support from New Mexico Main Street in the community. There is an application process for both of these, and we do have the RFPs were out and closed January 31st for both the ACDs, the Frontier communities, as well as the Main Street program. Just like Main Street, both ACDs and Frontier community projects must show some positive economic impact in the community by way of job creation, business development, business creation, expansion, and/or leveraging of public or private reinvestment to enhance the socio-economic environment in the community. Arts and cultural districts, I might want to point out, is that have a very similar 4-point approach, different language, but very, very similar to Main Street. So those of you who are working in Arts and Cultural District have an opportunity to see how we're approaching it at Main Street, and then look at how this applies to your Arts and Cultural District work as well. So I'm going to jump into the organization point. As Anna mentioned earlier, we're going to do 5 webinars. The first one I wanted to cover the background and the history, and then I'll talk about the organization point. Robin will be up next week to cover promotion, and then Keith and Amy Bell will go next with the design, and Keith will cover the economic vitality. And then Amy Barnhart and myself will finish up with the accreditation piece, so information that all your boards and you directors should know. Right? So the goal of the Main Street organization point, real simple: build and sustain a strong volunteer-driven Main Street organization. It comes down to basically 2 things, the organization point: building capacity and building resources, right? We define capacity as having the knowledge, the skills, and the abilities to do all these things, right? To operate a Main Street organization, corporation, nonprofit corporation, to develop economic development plans, engage the community around the vision and what they want to see in their district, implement the projects, right? Manage the resources, the volunteers, and then look at your performance and outcomes. So when I look at capacity, what is your knowledge and skills and abilities to do these things? The second component on the right of the screen is focused on resources, right? So this is the second side of the organization point. You should be ready to generate and utilize plans, strategies, partners, funding, other resources, etc. Right? So if you look at what the organization point is about, in essence, it's these 2 pieces right there. For those of you who aren't familiar with the process or engaged in the process right now, new communities come in as an application process. There's an initial review and then a readiness assessment with those that move forward from the initial review, and then a selection and designation process. If a community gets to the selection or the designation, it's about 12 to 18 months of heavy, intensive coaching in what's called the accelerator process. Historically, most of the Main Street communities just came in as a startup organization, were really left to their own devices on meeting the benchmark. So now you have a very intensive engagement from Main Street Revitalization Specialist to help you get to that next step. After that, proceeding through the accelerator process is when you're first really a Main Street program, and you either move to Main Street America affiliate or Main Street America accredited program, and that's an annual renewal process. In our last webinar, you'll hear Amy talk about what we do in the site visits and how we go through the accreditation process with each program. We have communities who move through this process fairly quickly. I think once we started this accelerator coaching, I think Alamogordo, Main Street, really good example of moving directly from accelerator to accredited in a short amount of time as well. So what's the work of your work as a Main Street organization? First of all, you become that centralized infrastructure to lead the revitalization process. And that means you're structuring processes that lead to economic goals. You're assuming responsibility for performance on economic projects via the 4-point approach. You're maintaining continuous communication with the stakeholders. And it's important, the stakeholders piece, is because this is a community-driven, community-based economic development initiative. Right? Constantly support people throughout the work and build incremental successes, and then implement economic development goals and strategies to achieve some economic outcome in the district. Here's what it looks like. There's a partnership with three main entities: local government, state government, and the Revitalization Corporation, whether that's the Main Street organization or the entity that's leading the arts and cultural district work. The work of that corporation is to bring the community stakeholders to that process. So the lower three, local government, state corporation, the state government, and the nonprofit corporation, that relationship is really formalized through a biannual MOU when you become a Main Street program, so that's every 2 years. And then in that MOU, there are commitments that everybody has to agree to. So the local government partner has to not only philosophically commit to work with you on doing the work, but they have to assist in the coordination and planning of your economic development projects in your community. They're required to provide financial support for your operations, and that's based on the size of the community, so how much they have to provide. And if there's capital outlay funding for public infrastructure, they become the fiscal agent for those resources, because the state cannot provide those resources directly to a nonprofit corporation. New Mexico Main Street provides technical assistance, access to capital outlay, does the coordination and reporting to both the state legislature and the National Main Street Center, oversees your compliance. Those of you who are unable to meet legal compliance of being a nonprofit organization, the state cannot provide its resources to you, so it oversees that as well. And it coordinates with other partners, Department of Cultural Affairs, New Mexico Arts, Historic Preservation Division, and others. Your work is that set of bullets at the bottom is to implement the projects, generate some resources for your operations and for the projects, do the planning work and the reporting pieces, and then coordinate with the city and the state. And most importantly, don't forget, bring in the community stakeholders in the space. So your clients are not only your downtown businesses and property owners, but also the residents in the community that have a stake in that downtown. Important to know, especially for those new executive directors, is that the MOU is a 2-year piece, and that binds the 3 partners. So the Revitalization Corporation, the local government, the state government, to do the work. All of you are almost all of you are at the point where you are executing a scope of services contract with your local government each year, and that's usually a procurement instrument. And that allows the local government to direct the funds for your operations and your work through that contract. So the contracts usually change from one year to the next. There's a little bit of a adjustment to the scope of work. Some communities, local governments will ask you to take on a couple more events or refocus on a specific public infrastructure project. And those are the changes that you'll see every 2 years. A little bit about the organizational structure. Traditionally, we went into a community and asked them to establish committees under the 4 points, right? So you have a nonprofit organization, usually a one-person operation with an executive director, and then teams or historically committees around each of the 4 points. And the committees were tasked to implement projects in each of those areas with the support of the Main Street executive director. A couple of years ago, Robin Beaubien, who was the promotion revitalization specialist for New Mexico Main Street, was also serving at the time as the Clovis Main Street director, really pioneered this process of moving away from committees to task forces, right? And so it allowed in smaller communities that didn't, same 10 people or the same 3 people, right, who were doing all this work, to move from one task to another and not require the organization to staff, man, and coordinate multiple committees. And the idea of the task force really is you're expected to do work in each of the 4 points, but now you can create teams around specific tasks, like the business directory or the website development or the cleanup, right? A group of volunteers come in, they don't have to commit to a committee for the next year, right? They can engage a project they're interested in, and when they're done, hopefully they've had a good experience, they'll come back and work on a different project, right? But it removes the constraint of having to create and staff committees and approach. So we like, some communities have mentioned to us that they like the committee approach and committee chairs because they feel like they have stronger accountability there, and other communities have told us they really like the task force approach because it allows people to move from one task to another and they can get things done a little bit easier for them. Each organization, talk a little bit about the board, right? I have a whole set of trainings around a board of directors and their responsibilities, and we're going to, we discussed at the quarterly meeting last week, we'll be doing 6 regional trainings around the state. It's a half a day of nonprofit management training, and the second half of the day really around how the boards Main Street and Arts and Cultural District organizations engage and do this work, right? But just a quick overview, board responsibilities have some responsibilities in funding and fundraising the organization, or making sure that adequate resources are there to do the work. And sometimes that means looking at what initiatives have to be cut back in order to maintain sort of fiscal solvency as well. So there's a strong financial management component. That's a legal requirement of the board. Advocacy, policy development, planning your work is critical for the board to work with the executive directors. Hiring and overseeing the staff, usually the executive director. Any other staff that are hired are usually under the oversight of the executive director. So boards don't get heavily involved in overseeing administrative assistants or event coordinators. That responsibility usually falls on the executive director. If you have committees or task forces, the board should be overseeing those committees or task forces with the support of the executive director, and then make sure that you develop strategies and implement projects to achieve those outcomes. Most boards, anywhere from 17 to 13 people, you want a broad-based group, right? You want some stakeholders, whether they're property owners or business owners from the district, but you should not limit yourself to just that. Anyone who has an interest in contributing and serving on the organization and moving some of your strategies forward as well should be included as well. So generally speaking, your board members should give somewhere between 4 to 10 hours a month, especially if they're serving on task forces and committees. You'll see your executive committee, your president, vice president, secretary, treasurer, probably approach the higher number in that range, probably 8 or 10 hours a month. Your committees and task forces, what's their job? Well, first of all, to meet regularly, develop work plans around their specific point, implement projects, report back to the board on how those are going, and to make sure they keep records of committee work and successes, right? You should expect your task force members or your committee members to know what Main Street work is about, right? So if you're bringing in volunteers and it's just for a specific task, like an event, an art walk, you want to provide a brief orientation about what your Main Street work is and what the promotion point is around that one, so they understand that. If they're going to be on a committee, that's usually a year commitment. Task force and/or committee members, usually a couple of hours a month. We'd love to see them attend our training because they develop a better understanding of the work, and often that leads to them becoming a really good board member when they're volunteering on a committee or task force. So we'd love to see them in the space. They need to take responsibility for projects and then support the activities of the organization and represent it positively. So this is critical. When you have a volunteer coming in to help you for an event, they have to understand your organization and represent it well, because they're now your ambassadors in the community, and they have a very public face. The role of the director. Well, first of all, one thing I need to make sure you directors know is that your job is not to do all the work of the committees or the volunteers or all the work that's identified in your work plans, right? The Main Street work, moving the 4 points and to some economic outcome, is very big work, and no one person can do this by themselves. So those of you who are board members listening to the webinar, I urge you to make sure you're taking an active role. Those of you who are board chairs, make sure your board members and committee members are taking an active role in that process. But sometimes the executive director has to provide that nudge around. The director is usually the first connection and the primary connection between the state Main Street program and your local Main Street program. Also that connection, the liaison between the city and your Main Street program. So sometimes, and often the executive director has information that no one else in your organization has, and they have to kind of nudge things along. Your director should focus quite a bit in supporting the board in volunteer management on your project, public relations, fundraising, and primarily grant writing, right? But you'll see a lot of directors have a lead role in fundraising events with the support of other board members. And then they're usually the first project coordinator. They're not the project implementer all the time. So again, big work. You want to take it on with a team approach. Executive Director helps coordinate annual planning, and then is required to receive all the training that we provide, and hopefully they're taking it back to your community and delivering that training as well. What works? What makes a good executive director? Well, I have this list of about 24 elements that I share with boards when they're in the hiring process. No one community can meet all those elements, but here's some of the key ones. Excellent people skills, somebody who's organized, good communication skills. You need somebody who's going to be a self-starter. This is critical. Most Main Street organizations are one-person organizations. We are a very technology-oriented society, so computer skills are important. You have to be able to delegate tasks to your volunteers and/or task forces, as well as multitask. Good. It helps if you're thick-skinned, because often you're going to be the first one that's hearing a complaint from a business owner, a property owner, or a member of the community. And so you want to make sure that you have a fairly composed attitude when you're engaging the public. Most importantly, and you don't see it on the screen right now, it's important to have project management skills, and why we provide some project management training for new directors as well. So let's talk a little bit about the funding pieces. I'll try and move this fairly quickly. Historically, this was the formula that we suggested for Main Street communities, that you received about 30% of your funds from the public funding source, usually through that MOU and the scope of services contract, about a third of your money from the stakeholders themselves in the business district, and that might take the form of sponsorships or corporate donations or matching funds for facade squads. Another third from the community, which might include just general donations and grants that you might be writing, and maybe a smaller percentage from things like t-shirt sales or selling refreshments at one of your events, any other miscellaneous income. This is a general formula. You should look at it just from the standpoint of you need to have a diverse funding stream to be a successful Main Street program. Amy Barnhart does a great job of teaching both a 3-part fundraising training and a 4-part grant writing series to assist you in this process. And so she'll be talking about that in some of her presentations, the 4th or 5th webinar in this series as well. So I've already talked about the sources of funding you can generate for your work. Don't forget that there are things like tax increment financing, lodger's tax, MRA tools, all these other tools that help you with some of your bigger projects, and particularly public infrastructure projects as well. The board should and is expected to have a large role and a critical role in fundraising, financial management. So developing and adopting an annual budget, planning your resource development projects, whether they be fundraising events or grant writing or corporate cultivation, corporate donor cultivation, those kind of things. Your board members should make a contribution once a year to the organization to the best of their ability. Almost all the private foundation grants right now are asking, is your board 100% invested, right? So it doesn't matter if a board member can make a $5 donation or a $500 donation, every board member should make an annual contribution to the organization. You need to make sure there's sufficient funds each year to run the operations and the projects, monitor the program finances, and then report those on your IRS 990s, prove the expenditures. If there's an audit, then the board is the entity that authorizes that audit. And for those of you who reach more than $500,000 of revenues, total revenues that are coming to your organization in any given fiscal year, it triggers a requirement of an automatic audit by the Attorney General's office, and that's generally about a $10,000 to $12,000 cost. So if you're approaching close to $500,000 in revenues for whatever reason, you're going to need to start thinking about setting aside some money for the audit. And finally, the board should have a very critical role in developing a long-term funding strategy for the organization. Your role as executive directors to serve in the fundraising work. First, serve as that PR ambassador, make sure the fundraising plans are implemented, and that means coordinating the volunteers that need to help you with that as well, right? Identify the potential donors, assist with donor cultivation, donor development, fundraising materials, tracking the contributions and other record keeping. Grant writing is almost exclusively, not always, but almost exclusively left to the executive director. We do have some very good board members who have this skill and are willing to donate that time in grant writing for your organization, right? And then finally, your role as an executive director is to assist with fundraising events. The committee or the task force working on fundraising, prepare fundraising plans, build funder relationships, coordinating annual contribution campaigns, and oversee the fundraising activities, right? This is a very good role if you have an organization committee for them to take on not just the legal and the compliance work or nominating new board members, but to really focus on how are we going to generate funds for our operations and for our projects as well. A couple of things about work plans. We talked about earlier about identifying transformation strategies and all your 4 points, projects really achieving some outcome in those strategies. Just want to share with new executive directors and new board members, for each activity under each point, for each strategy, you should have projects under each of the 4 points. And then for each activity, you're listing, or for each project, who's responsible, what funding are you allocating, or do you need to budget to that? What's the timeline for getting it done? And then how do you know, right? What are the metrics of your success? These have to be reflected in board adopted plans. In the last couple of years, we've asked each committee to prioritize, to spend your time on the transformation strategies, and now that everybody's getting closer to really firming those up well, we'll spend some time looking at what are your projects and your plans and that the board has adopted to move that strategy, right? So you're expected to have each Main Street organization, 2 economic transformation strategies. We're looking at least one from an arts and cultural district, an economic transformation strategy. And then from each a capacity building strategy. How do you get this done? And then what are your projects? Who's involved? And then project implementation plans. Again, the last couple of years, because we want everybody focused on really clarifying what their transformation strategies. We didn't spend too much time on project implementation plans, but once you get to that space where you know what your projects are, you really should develop an implementation plan for each project, and I'll show you what that looks like. Your transformation strategies, 3 key areas, right? Understand the conditions on the ground. That includes some market research and what's the community vision. Establish your strategies which provide a clear sense of priorities, and then how are you going to implement that through the 4 points? And then the third part of it is what is the outcome you are trying to achieve? So there's 3 elements of your economic transformation strategies. 2 types, catalyst strategies, the first type, and there's 2 areas underneath that, strategies that are based on a specific customer group, and then strategies that are based on a specific product, service, or business. And I'll explain those here shortly. The second type is customized strategies. So usually more mature, more advanced Main Street Arts and Cultural District programs are starting to looking at customized strategies based on different market information, much more complex activities. So let's explore this a little bit. Customer-based strategies focus on specific clientele, right? Are you a college town? Are you trying to draw in the college students into your district? Are you looking at bringing families into the district or elders? Are you looking at specific niches, like if you're close to a military base? Are you trying to attract that military audience into the district? So that means your strategies are focused on drawing in a specific set of customers. Most of our communities indicate, yeah, we want them all, right? So we don't see a whole lot of that. We see a lot more product-based strategies. Is your Main Street work about specific products, local agriculture, local food? entertainment and nightlife, home furnishings, professional services, etc. Right? So we see a lot of this moving through our Main Street communities and arts and cultural districts. And then some of the other catalyst strategies that we talked about, these a little bit more based on more substantive market information in your district, arts and creative economy. And so we have arts and cultural districts heavily focused on this. Are you focused on just the district workers and residents, right? Trying to maybe reduce leakage when those residents are moving outside of the district to purchase a product that you don't have downtown. Are you trying to capitalize on a knowledge economy, so technology-based, light manufacturing, and/or tourism? So these are much more complex catalyst strategies for economic development work. Many of you have seen this before. I won't spend too much time on it, but this is just a quick overview of how you might want to identify a strategy for your district, delineate what the outcomes you want to see, and then line up your 4 points projects to move that strategy to those outcomes, right? And we have a couple of other webinars on the YouTube channel that really explore this in depth, and Keith will spend a little bit more time talking about this as well. This is a sample project implementation plan for a promotions project. So if you look at the previous slide I had, one of the items under promotions was to create a business directory. This is a sort of a step-by-step, a PIP, a project implementation plan is a step-by-step, what are the tasks to get that project done. And so in this case, produce a business directory, who's responsible, when are we going to get it done, who's going to get it done by when, and then any other comments or things you need to add, like we need to generate $5,525 to fund it, right? So there's a revenue piece that might come out of that as well. Just so you don't feel bad that we're asking you to do this, New Mexico Main Street has adopted 3 transformation strategies as well at the request of the National Main Street Center, and this really encompasses all of the work that we're doing in your communities. Build capacity for local economic revitalization and redevelopment, enhance the entrepreneurial and creative economy, and create thriving places through placemaking and preservation activities. And so all of New Mexico Main Street work is really feeds into these 3 strategies, and all the outcomes we're working towards supporting you with are driven by these 3 strategies as well. I won't spend a whole lot of time with this because Amy will cover this in the last workshop. There are 10 performance standards that the National Main Street Center has established. These guide your accreditation process. We have a self-assessment for this, and then our site visits really help us understand how you're doing in meeting these 10 performance standards. So you'll hear more about this in the final webinar around accreditation and executive director certification. So a couple of things around what's going to help you be successful organizationally, especially for you executive directors and board chairs. Constantly communicate, say what you're going to do, and then do what you say you're going to do, right? Establish clear roles and responsibilities and assignments. As a director or as a board chair, you are the 2 traffic managers of all this work, right? So make sure that your task forces, your teams have clear responsibilities. Constantly recruit and thank your volunteers. If you need to recruit for specific skills, right, then do that. Recruit somebody who's going to help you with a website or with a facade improvement project. Follow your written project plans, evaluate and refresh your work. So sometimes if you leave your work plans sitting on the shelf for a year, it doesn't give you the chance to check in and see how you're doing or what adjustments you need to make. So I recommend that you look at your work plans at least quarterly. If it's not built into the board's annual agenda, how are we reviewing that, right? So at least quarterly. For executive directors, board chairs, and all volunteers, have fun with the work, because if you're not having fun, it just makes this work so much harder. Don't forget to ask for the help when you really could use it. New Mexico Main Street provides a lot of support, a lot of resources. We are trying to support 28 Main Street communities, number of frontier community projects, and ACDs. So on some occasions, we're spread a little bit thinner, but do not hesitate to ask for the help you need. We're here for that. I'll close up with just a real quick overview of what you can ask for assistance with under the organization point. These are the elements that are in a service request that are available for download on the MainStreet website, which is the under the resources section. Fill out the service request and send that in to Julie and Rich, or Julie, Rich, and Daniel, and they'll get that approved and routed to the appropriate specialist as we work. But just wanted to cover some of the areas that Amy and I provide supports under the organization support. So with that, we have a few minutes before 1 o'clock. I'm willing to take any questions you might have. So those of you who want to raise your hand, click the button and raise your hand, we'll unmute you and you can ask your questions to the whole audience. Or if you just want to type it into the question box, we'll feel free to ask any questions there.
All right. We're not seeing any questions. People are being shy today. All right, thank you. We've got some great comments, and I'm glad folks, it looks like, who are having trouble dialing in seem to be successful with that. And remember, for future webinars coming up, that when you register for a webinar, a custom set of information goes out to you, track your registration. So your dial-in information is going to be different for each person.
And just a reminder that because this webinar included both the history and the background and the covering the asset-based approaches as well as the organization point, this one was probably a little bit longer than the webinars you'll see from Amy Bell and Rob and Keith as well. So we hope to move through those a little bit faster. We don't see any other questions coming up. I do want to say on your control panel on the right, there are 3 documents in that handout section on the control panel for the go to webinar. One is a set of slides that I just showed you. The second one is sort of the slides 3 to a page with a little notes pages. And the third one is just an overview of the 10 standards and how we that self-assessment piece. So if you want to download those, you can look at what we're expecting you to do around the accreditation process and the 10 standards. And Amy will cover that again a little bit more in depth in the final webinar end of this month, in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, the last of this series, I think, ends on March 15th. So they're coming in quick succession. There's a gap between, I think, the 4th and the 5th webinar. And I will send out reminders. And again, please register for those. We will be posting this presentation today. So I think because it is a great introductory webinar, probably is wonderful to share with other board members or new volunteers just to orient them to the Main Street 4-point approach. And any of the webinars in our series coming up would be great to share. So we will be posting this to the New Mexico Main Street YouTube page, which you can access from the Main Street homepage. And our web address is www.nmmainstreet.org. And if you'll see the social media icons on the home page, and you'll be able to click on YouTube.
And if you have questions after today, they come up. Our contact information is right here on the screen as well. Anything about this specific webinar, feel free to reach out to any of us, and we'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
And thank you so much for joining us today. And we look forward to connecting with you next week. And thank you, Eduardo, for your presentation.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us.